My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and for 5 years I worked double shifts, sacrificed my own comfort, and stood quietly by my husband Julian while he pursued his law degree. On the day he finally graduated, I sat at his lavish celebration dinner, expecting a simple thank you. Instead of gratitude, he handed me divorce papers in front of 50 guests. He proudly announced that he was entering the legal elite and needed a wife who fit his new wealthy aesthetic, not a tired woman who crunched numbers in a cubicle. He thought I would walk away broken and empty-handed. He had no idea that my cubicle job had given me the exact tools to orchestrate his absolute financial and professional ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth. The crystal glasses chimed a crisp, clear sound that echoed across the private dining room of the Regent, one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in downtown Atlanta. The room was bathed in warm golden light from the massive chandeliers above us. 50 of our supposed closest family and friends were gathered around elegantly decorated tables. They were all dressed in their absolute best. This was meant to be a night of black excellence, a celebration of Julian finally passing the bar exam and securing a position at Sterling & Sterling, the most prestigious law firm in the city. I sat at the head table wearing a simple black dress that I had bought off the rack 3 years ago. I had spent every spare dollar we had on Julian so he could afford his custom-tailored suits, his luxury car payments, and his endless networking dinners. I had eaten cheap ramen noodles in the dark while he dined on expensive steaks with his classmates. I had proofread his essays at 3 in the morning before waking up at 6 to go to my own demanding job. I smiled warmly as the room fell silent and all eyes turned toward our table. Julian stood up from his chair. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive midnight blue jacket. He looked incredibly handsome and confident, soaking in the admiration of the room, like he was a king surveying his kingdom. He raised his glass of imported champagne and looked out at the crowd. I leaned forward slightly. I had worked 80-hour weeks at my accounting firm for 5 long years. I had taken on the most exhausting clients just to make sure his tuition was paid and his life was comfortable. I was ready for him to finally acknowledge us, to acknowledge me and the silent sacrifices I had made to get him to this exact moment. Tonight is not just about me. Julian began, his voice smooth and loud enough for the entire room to hear. It is about the relentless pursuit of greatness. It is about rising above your circumstances and demanding the life you deserve. He smiled, revealing perfect teeth that I had paid to have fixed with my hard-earned bonus money 2 years ago. I am standing here as a lawyer ready to change the world. I want to thank my mother Beatrice for giving me the bloodline of a king and teaching me never to settle. I want to thank my sister Vanessa for always believing in my vision and pushing me to demand more out of life. He paused. The room was silent. I waited for my name. I waited for the loving gaze of a husband who knew he could not have done it without his wife. Julian looked down at me. His expression was not filled with love or gratitude. It was completely cold and calculating. He reached inside the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick yellow envelope and dropped it right onto my porcelain dinner plate. The heavy paper landed with a soft thud next to my half-eaten meal. "And Maya," Julian said, his voice dropping the warmth it had just held, "I want to thank you for recognizing that my journey has outgrown you." I stared at the yellow envelope. The return address in the corner belonged to a high-profile family law attorney in the city. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. "Open it," Julian commanded loudly. The entire room of 50 guests was staring at us. Complete silence had fallen over the dining room. You could hear a pin drop. I slowly picked up the envelope and unsealed the flap. Inside was a legal petition for divorce. I read the bold black letters at the top of the page. I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me instead of the panic he was expecting. "Julian," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly steady so that only the people at our table could hear the underlying steel in my tone. "You are doing this right now, here in front of everyone." Julian nodded slowly and took a sip of his champagne. I am entering the legal elite now, Maya. I am a sterling lawyer. I am going to be making over $300,000 a year starting next week. My firm deals with high net worth individuals, politicians, and celebrities. I need a partner who understands that lifestyle. I need a wife who fits the aesthetic of my new reality. He waved his hand dismissively toward me, looking at my simple dress like it was an infectious disease. You are a small-time accountant. You crunch numbers in a gray cubicle. You are always exhausted. You do not dress the part. You do not speak the part. You have been a good stepping stone, but you have held me back for the last 2 years. I am cutting the dead weight before my career truly takes off. Gasps echoed from a few tables in the back, but the people closest to us remained completely still. Before I could even respond to his unbelievable cruelty, the sound of a chair scraping loudly against the floor broke the tension. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, stood up from her seat next to Julian. She was wearing a flamboyant emerald gown that she had convinced me to buy for her just last week, under the guise of wanting to look presentable for her son. "Do not make a scene, Maya," Beatrice said sharply, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Julian is right. You are suitable for his struggle phase, but a man of his caliber needs a sophisticated woman by his side. A woman of pedigree. You come from a working-class background. You just do not possess the refinement required for the circles my son will now be traveling in. It is nothing personal, it is simply a matter of class." I looked at Beatrice. This was the same woman whose electricity bill I had paid every single month for the last 3 years to keep her lights on. This was the woman who secretly begged me for grocery money, because she spent her meager pension on country club fees she could not afford. Before I could speak, my sister-in-law Vanessa chimed in from across the table. Vanessa adjusted her fake designer watch and scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Just sign the papers, Maya." Vanessa sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not try to drag this out and ruin his big night. You knew this was coming. You held him back long enough with your small mindset and your lack of ambition. Have some dignity and walk away. Leave him to the life he actually belongs in. You should be grateful he even let you attend this dinner." I looked at the three of them. Julian was smirking, completely pleased with himself. Beatrice had her nose in the air, acting like a wealthy matriarch instead of a woman drowning in hidden debt. Vanessa was glaring at me with raw jealousy disguised as superiority. 50 guests were watching me, waiting for me to break down. They expected me to cry, to scream, to throw my drink in his face, or to beg him to reconsider on my knees. I did none of those things. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my pain. I placed the divorce petition neatly back into the yellow envelope. I set the envelope down on the pristine white tablecloth. I picked up my napkin, gently wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it next to my plate. I stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of my simple black dress. I looked Julian dead in the eyes, ensuring he saw no fear, only absolute calm. "Congratulations on passing the bar, Julian," I said. My voice carried clearly across the silent room, unwavering and strong. "I genuinely hope your new life is exactly what you deserve." I picked up my purse from the back of my chair. I did not shed a single tear. I turned my back on him, ignored the smug expressions of his mother and sister, and walked out of the private dining room with my head held high. I could hear the immediate eruption of whispers and hushed conversations as the heavy mahogany dining room doors swung shut behind me. I walked down the grand hallway of the restaurant and stepped out into the cool evening air of Atlanta. The valet immediately ran to fetch my car. I stood on the sidewalk as the bright city lights blurred around me. The air felt incredibly fresh in my lungs. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and scrolled down to a number I had saved under a fake name to keep it hidden. My fingers moved quickly over the glowing screen. I typed out a single sentence. "Activate Plan B. Freeze everything." I hit send and watched the message turn blue. Julian thought he was discarding a small-time accountant who would crawl away into the shadows. He did not know that my boring cubicle job was actually a high-level forensic accounting position. He did not know that I held the commercial lien on the house he proudly claimed as his own. He did not know that every single dollar he possessed was tied to a financial trap I had carefully laid over the last 5 years. He wanted a sudden divorce to protect his new wealth from me. By tomorrow morning, Julian was going to find out that he had absolutely nothing left to protect. The drive back to our 4-bedroom house in the upscale suburbs took exactly 22 minutes. I drove in absolute silence, letting the cool air conditioning dry my skin. I pulled into the driveway and parked my sedan next to the empty space where Julian kept the luxury sports car I paid the lease on every month. The house was blazing with light. I walked up the stone pathway, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside to a scene that would have broken a weaker woman. My entire life had been shoved into heavy-duty black trash bags. They were piled haphazardly in the center of my meticulously decorated living room. My winter coats, my carefully curated book collection, and the framed photographs of my late father were stuffed into plastic like garbage. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa, looking entirely too comfortable, were my mother-in-law Beatrice and my sister-in-law Vanessa. They had left the restaurant right after I did to beat me here. Beatrice was holding a crystal glass filled with my most expensive vintage wine. She took a slow sip and sighed in exaggerated pleasure. Vanessa was scrolling through her phone, her feet propped up on my glass coffee table with her shoes still on. I stood in the foyer, keys still in my hand. Neither of them looked surprised or guilty. They looked like landlords waiting to evict a troublesome tenant. Beatrice set her glass down on a coaster. She smoothed the fabric of her emerald gown and gave me a patronizing smile. "You are home earlier than expected, Maya," she said smoothly. "We figured you would need some time to cool off at a cheap motel. Julian asked us to come by and pack your things so the transition could be as seamless as possible. He owns this house outright after all, and he wants you gone tonight." Vanessa did not look up from her phone. She laughed, a high-pitched grating sound. "Do not act so shocked," Vanessa chimed in. "Julian is a lawyer now. He knows his rights. His name is on the deed. You transferred the down payment to his account before the closing so he could build his credit. That makes this his property. He is being generous by not having you escorted out by the police. Grab your garbage bags and call an Uber." I slowly walked further into the room. I looked at the black plastic bags containing 5 years of my hard work and quiet submission. I looked at the two women who had happily lived off my secret financial support while treating me like the hired help. They truly believed they held all the power. They believed the piece of paper with Julian's name on it meant he owned the kingdom. I felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. I did not yell. I simply walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the bottle, and poured myself a glass. Before I could take a sip, the sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor caught my attention. The noise was coming from down the hall, specifically from the master bedroom. I watched as a young woman stepped into the living room light. It was Chloe. She was the spoiled daughter of the senior partner and the woman Julian had been sleeping with for 6 months. I knew about her, of course. My forensic accounting skills extended far beyond corporate audits. I had tracked every expensive dinner, every hotel room, and every jewelry purchase Julian had made using our joint accounts. Chloe stood there looking incredibly smug. What made the scene absolutely infuriating was that she was wearing my pure silk robe. It was a custom embroidered piece I had bought for myself in Paris during my only solo vacation. She had the sash tied tightly around her waist, acting as if she were the lady of the manor. Chloe leaned against the doorframe and gave me a look of profound pity. "Maya," she said softly, using a tone you would use to calm down a stray dog, "I know this is hard for you. Breakups are never easy, especially when you realize you have been playing out of your league. Julian is a brilliant man destined for incredible things. He needs a woman who understands the nuances of high society. A woman who can host senior partners, not someone who smells like printer ink and microwave dinners. You are working class, Maya. There is no shame in that, but Julian belongs to my world now." Beatrice clapped her hands together in delight. "Exactly, Chloe darling," Beatrice crowed. "You are such a breath of fresh air, a true match for my son." Vanessa nodded vigorously, pointing her phone at me as if she were recording my humiliation. Chloe walked over to my marble kitchen counter. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and clicked a gold pen. She scribbled a number with agonizing slowness, tore the check from the book, and walked over to hand it to me. I looked down at the paper. It was a check for $50,000. For your trouble, Chloe said, tossing the check so it fluttered down onto the floor at my feet. Use it to rent a nice little apartment in a neighborhood more suited to your tax bracket. Buy yourself some new clothes. Move on with your life quietly. If you make a fuss, my father has an entire floor of ruthless attorneys who will tie you up in court until you are bankrupt. Take the money, Maya. It is the best deal you are going to get tonight. I stared at the check resting against the expensive oak floorboards. $50,000. It was a generous bribe from a girl who had never worked a day in her life, funded by a father who I already knew was under federal investigation. I looked back up at Chloe. She was smiling, waiting for me to break down. I did not bend down to pick up the check. Instead, I crushed the expensive paper under the heel of my shoe. I stepped forward. Her smug smile faltered. I reached over to the side table next to the sofa. Resting on it was a large, ornate crystal vase. It was an antique piece Beatrice claimed was a family heirloom. It was her most prized possession in this house. I picked up the heavy crystal vase with one hand. Beatrice gasped, sitting up straight. "Put that down, Maya," she snapped. "That is worth more than your entire wardrobe." I looked Beatrice dead in the eye and let the vase slip from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Beatrice screamed. Vanessa jumped to her feet. Chloe took a frightened step back, pulling my silk robe tighter around her body. "Now that I have your undivided attention," I said, my voice cutting through the ringing silence. "Julian's name is on the deed because I transferred the down payment to him and let him sign the closing papers. But Julian was so eager to play the wealthy homeowner that he never actually read the fine print of the financing." I pulled a folded legal document from my purse and tossed it onto the coffee table right over the shattered glass. Julian did not get a traditional mortgage from a bank. His credit score was abysmal because Vanessa used his social security number to open credit cards 5 years ago. I secured the financing through my own private company. Julian signed a commercial lien agreement. I am his lender. For 5 years, I have been paying myself back, using the money I earned. Beatrice stared at the paper, her face turning a sickly shade of pale. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means," I replied, stepping right over the broken crystal, "that when Julian served me with divorce papers tonight, he triggered a default clause in his commercial loan agreement. As his lender, I am calling in the debt, immediately." The smile completely vanished from Chloe's face. Vanessa looked frantically between me and the document on the table. "Julian owes my company $400,000, I stated clearly. Since his bank accounts are currently frozen, he has no way to pay it." I looked directly at Chloe. "You can tell your brilliant lawyer boyfriend that he has exactly 24 hours to produce $400,000 in cash to clear the lien. If the money is not wired to my company by tomorrow morning, I will initiate foreclosure proceedings. I will seize this property and change the locks." I calmly picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, and smiled brightly at the 3 terrified women. "Please enjoy the house tonight, ladies. It is the last time that you will ever step foot inside of it." Morning sunlight poured through the windows of Chloe's luxury penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Julian stretched his arms across the silk sheets, feeling absolutely invincible. He had successfully dropped the dead weight of his past and stepped into his bright, wealthy future. Chloe was still asleep beside him, her blonde hair spilled across the pillows. Julian quietly slipped out of bed, walked into the glass-enclosed bathroom, and smiled at his reflection. Today was Friday. He had the weekend to prepare for his grand entrance at Sterling and Sterling on Monday morning. But a man entering the legal elite could not wear an off-the-rack suit. He needed something bespoke. 2 hours later, Julian stood on a velvet pedestal inside one of the most exclusive menswear boutiques in Buckhead. A master tailor was pinning the hem of a stunning charcoal gray Italian wool suit. Julian admired himself in the mirror, catching the sharp lines of the jacket. He felt like the man he was always destined to become. The suit was priced at exactly $3,000. Julian walked to the mahogany checkout counter with a swagger in his step. The boutique manager smiled obsequiously as he handed over the garment bag. Julian casually reached into his designer wallet and pulled out his metal platinum card. It was tied to the joint account he shared with Maya, where she deposited her hefty quarterly bonuses. He handed the card to the manager without a second thought. The manager slid the card into the reader. The machine processed, then emitted a sharp beep. The manager frowned, tapping the screen. "It seems there is an issue with the chip, sir," the manager said politely. "Let me try it again." Julian sighed, acting mildly inconvenienced. The machine beeped again. A bright red message flashed. "Declined. Contact card issuer." The manager cleared his throat, avoiding Julian's eyes. "I am sorry, sir, but the card has been declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Julian felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. Two other wealthy patrons in the store turned their heads. Declined was a word Julian despised. It reminded him of the poverty he had worked so hard to escape. "Nonsense," Julian snapped, snatching the card back. "There is over $80,000 in that account. Run it again." The manager obliged. The result was the same. Declined. Julian gritted his teeth, pulling out his personal credit card. "Run this one," he demanded. The manager swiped the second card. The machine beeped immediately. Declined. The silence in the boutique was suddenly deafening. Julian grabbed his cards, his face burning with absolute humiliation. He muttered an excuse about a bank fraud alert and stormed out, leaving the custom suit sitting on the counter. Julian practically ran to his sports car parked on the street. He slammed the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside the quiet leather interior. His hands were shaking as he unlocked his phone and tapped his mobile banking application. The screen loaded. Julian stared at the numbers, completely unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Every single account tied to his name was grayed out. The joint checking account read 0. His personal savings account read 0. His high-limit credit cards all displayed the same terrifying message: account suspended, available credit 0. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He aggressively tapped the screen, trying to refresh the application, convinced it was a glitch. The numbers did not change. He had absolutely nothing. No cash, no credit, no access to a single dollar. He frantically dialed Maya's number. It rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice was infuriatingly calm, accompanied by the sound of a coffee cup being set down on a desk. "Good morning, Julian," Maya said smoothly. "I assume you are calling about the banking error you just discovered while trying to buy something you cannot afford." Julian gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "What did you do, Maya?" he yelled, his voice echoing inside the car. "Turn the accounts back on right now. You cannot just steal my money. I will sue you for financial abuse." Maya let out a soft, genuine laugh. Her amusement made his blood boil even hotter. "Steal your money," Maya repeated slowly. "Julian, you have not deposited a single paycheck into that joint account in 3 years. You have been a full-time student living entirely off my income. It is my money. As for the legalities, I am honestly shocked you do not understand the consequences of your own actions. You are a lawyer now, are you not? Did you even read the divorce petition you served me with last night?" Julian froze. He had hired a shark of an attorney to draft the papers, but he had been so focused on the dramatic delivery that he had only skimmed the actual filing. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "When a petitioner files for divorce in this state," Maya explained with the patience of a kindergarten teacher, "it automatically triggers a temporary restraining order on all contested marital assets. It is a standard financial freeze to prevent either party from draining the accounts before a judge can divide it. By handing me those papers and formally filing them yesterday, you legally locked yourself out of my money. The bank simply complied with the court order first thing this morning. I did not steal anything, Julian. You froze your own accounts. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He was a brilliant law school graduate, yet he had played himself perfectly into her hands. But my personal credit cards? Julian stammered. Those are in my name. Maya sighed softly. I was the primary guarantor on those cards, Julian. I called the companies this morning and removed myself as the financial backer. Since you have no verifiable income history and massive student debt, they immediately suspended your lines of credit. You have nothing, Julian. You are exactly where you started before you met me. Maya hung up the phone. The line went dead. Julian sat in his car, staring blankly at his dark phone screen. His perfect morning had rapidly deteriorated into a waking nightmare. Before he could even gather his thoughts, his phone vibrated violently. The caller ID flashed his sister's name. He answered the call, expecting Vanessa to ask how his morning was going. Instead, he was assaulted by the sound of hysterical screaming. Julian, you have to help me! Vanessa shrieked into the phone, sobbing uncontrollably. They took it right out of the driveway. Julian rubbed his temples, a fierce headache blooming behind his eyes. Who took what? Vanessa, slow down and make sense. The repo men, Vanessa wailed. I was standing in the front yard talking to my neighbors. The entire street was watching. A tow truck just pulled up, hooked up my Range Rover and drove away with it. They said the lease was in default. Julian, I need you to call the dealership right now and fix this. I am a luxury real estate agent. I cannot show houses to wealthy clients driving a rental car. This is completely humiliating. Julian felt a heavy rock drop into the pit of his stomach. A terrifying realization began to wash over him. Vanessa, Julian said slowly, who pays the lease on your car? What do you mean, who pays the lease? Vanessa snapped. Maya pays it. She set up the direct debit 3 years ago when my business had that slow quarter. She said she was happy to support the family image. Just give me the money to get it back out of the impound lot today. Julian closed his eyes. The sheer scale of Maya's financial control over his family was finally becoming clear. She had not just been funding his life. She had been quietly propping up the illusion of success for his mother and his sister. She did not just cancel my cards, Julian muttered bitterly. She canceled all of us. What are you talking about, Julian? She demanded. Because you told her to sign the papers, Julian yelled, finally losing his temper. You pushed her over the edge. Now she is freezing every asset she touches. I cannot give you the money for the impound lot. I do not have a single working credit card right now. Vanessa gasped loudly over the phone. But what are we supposed to do? She cried. Mom has her country club dues next week. If Maya cuts us off, we are ruined. We have nothing. Julian gripped the steering wheel so hard his joints ached. His pride refused to let him admit total defeat. Listen to me carefully, Vanessa, Julian said smoothly. Let Maya play her petty financial games today. You tell Mom to keep quiet and stay out of it. Why? Vanessa sniffled. Because Julian replied, staring straight ahead. First thing Monday morning, I am hiring the most ruthless divorce attorney in Atlanta. I am going to strip her of every asset she owns, and I am going to completely destroy her. Monday morning arrived with the stifling, oppressive humidity typical of Atlanta in the summer, but inside the glass-walled conference room of my attorney's office, the air conditioning was set to a freezing temperature. I sat perfectly still at the long mahogany table. My attorney, an older, sharp-eyed woman named Helen, who had seen every dirty trick in the book, sat quietly beside me. We did not have to wait long. The heavy glass doors swung open and Julian marched in. He was wearing the same charcoal gray suit he had tried to buy on Friday, except this one looked slightly ill-fitting. It was likely purchased off the rack from a cheaper department store over the weekend, using whatever cash Chloe had in her purse. Following closely behind him was Richard Sterling, the senior partner of the law firm and Chloe's father. He was acting as Julian's personal counsel today. Richard was a notoriously aggressive bulldog lawyer, a man famous for bankrupting ex-wives and intimidating opposing counsel into submission. And right behind the powerful lawyer wearing an oversized pair of designer sunglasses indoors was Beatrice. They took their seats across from us with an air of absolute superiority. The bulldog lawyer did not even bother introducing himself or offering a handshake. He immediately opened a thick, genuine leather binder and tossed a stack of freshly printed papers across the table toward Helen. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the mahogany wood, trying to physically dominate the space. "My client is willing to be merciful this morning," the lawyer began, his voice a gravelly bark meant to inspire fear. "Despite your vindictive and frankly illegal little stunt with the bank accounts on Friday, we are prepared to offer a settlement that keeps you out of federal court and saves you from a devastating public trial." Julian smirked, adjusting his cheap tie, looking at me like I was a bug he was about to crush. The lawyer continued reading from his notes, not even making eye contact. "We are demanding immediate transfer of the deed to the suburban property, completely unencumbered by any liens you claim to hold. We are demanding spousal support to the tune of $10,000 a month for the next 3 years to facilitate my client's transition into his new lifestyle as a high-profile attorney. Furthermore, since you subjected my client to severe financial abuse by freezing his assets and attempting to humiliate him, we are claiming a 30% equity stake in your private accounting firm." Julian's earning potential at Sterling and Sterling is now astronomical. By holding him back, refusing to support his networking, and playing these petty financial games, you have damaged his early career trajectory. You owe him for the emotional distress, and frankly, you owe him for the privilege of being attached to his rising star for 5 years. I looked at Julian. He was sitting up perfectly straight, his chest puffed out, looking like he genuinely believed every ridiculous entitled word his lawyer had just spoken. Helen did not even pick up the papers they had thrown at us. She simply folded her hands in her lap and looked at me, waiting for my signal. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the sheer audacity of their demands wash over me. They wanted my house, my company, and my future income, all because Julian felt legally entitled to the wealth he had never worked a single day to build. Before I could even formulate a response to the lawyer's outrageous monologue, Beatrice decided to make her presence known. She removed her oversized sunglasses and placed them delicately on the table. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at you," Maya Beatrice said, shaking her head slowly. "Sitting there in that cheap polyester suit with your scuffed leather briefcase. You look exactly like the nobody you were the day my son found you. You should be down on your knees thanking him for bringing a touch of class into your miserable working-class existence." I glanced at my briefcase. It was genuine full-grain Italian leather that cost more than her entire wardrobe, but Beatrice would not know the difference because she only recognized luxury if it had a massive tacky designer logo plastered across the front. "Julian is a prince." Beatrice continued, her voice rising dramatically to fill the conference room. "He comes from a line of greatness. He was temporarily distracted by a peasant who tricked him into settling down, but now he has finally woken up. He is with a woman who can actually advance his standing in the world. Chloe is a Sterling. She comes from real money, real power, and real influence in this city. You are just a human calculator who got lucky. Do not embarrass yourself by fighting this, Maya. You do not have the stamina or the pedigree for a real war. Sign the papers, give my son what he rightfully deserves, and go back to your quiet, pathetic little life before we destroy it completely." Julian nodded heavily in agreement, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Listen to my mother, Maya," he said, using that same patronizing, sickeningly sweet tone Chloe had used on me in my own living room. "You played a good game on Friday, I will give you that. You caught me off guard with that lean trick. But I have the backing of a multi-million-dollar law firm now. Richard here destroys people like you before lunch. If you fight me on this, I will drag you through years of litigation. I will drown you in legal fees until you have to sell that pathetic accounting firm just to pay your rent. Just hand over the assets cleanly. It is the cost of doing business with a man destined for the absolute top." I let his words hang in the freezing air of the room. I looked at the three of them. A bulldog lawyer relying on old-school intimidation, an arrogant man-child relying on his new girlfriend's daddy, and a broke matriarch relying on delusions of grandeur. They thought they were the predators in this room. They thought they had backed me into an impossible corner. I slowly unclasped my briefcase. The heavy brass locks clicked loudly in the silent room, sounding like a judge's gavel. Helen finally spoke, her voice calm and remarkably polite. "We reject your settlement offer in its entirety," she stated simply, not a hint of fear in her tone. The bulldog lawyer scoffed, clearly offended that an older woman in a modest office was dismissing him so easily. "You are making a massive mistake," he growled, slamming his fist lightly on the table. "You have zero leverage here. My client is the injured party. He is the one whose career and financial stability have been maliciously compromised by a bitter ex-wife." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of papers. It was bound in a dark blue legal cover. I did not slide it to the bulldog lawyer. I slid it directly across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of Julian's hands. It was exactly 40 pages long. Julian looked down at it, frowning deeply. "What is this?" he asked, refusing to touch it like it was infected. "Another one of your fake legal threats or fabricated bank statements." "It is not a threat, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "And it is certainly not a marriage certificate or a standard prenuptial agreement. Open it and read the title." The bulldog lawyer, losing his patience, reached over and flipped the heavy blue cover open. His eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the first page. I watched in real time as the aggressive, confident color completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack. He quickly flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing suddenly becoming shallow and uneven. "What is it?" Richard Julian demanded, noticing his lawyer's sudden and uncharacteristic panic. "Read it to him, Richard," I instructed calmly. The lawyer swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the paper to me, then back to the paper. "It is a commercial business investment loan," the lawyer whispered, his voice completely losing its intimidating bark. "It was executed 5 years ago between Julian and your corporate financial entity." Julian snatched the document away from his lawyer, staring at his own signature at the bottom of the page. "What are you talking about?" Julian snapped, his voice cracking. "We had a joint account. You paid for my law school from our savings." I smiled, a cold, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "No, Julian, I did not," I replied softly. "Because you had terrible credit when we met. Thanks to your sister Vanessa destroying your financial history, we could not get you a traditional student loan. I told you I would handle the financing through my firm to keep the interest rates manageable. I put this exact 40-page document in front of you 5 years ago on our kitchen counter. I told you it was standard corporate paperwork to route the educational funds. You were so eager to get into law school and so incredibly dismissive of my boring accounting work that you signed every single page without reading a single word." Beatrice leaned forward, her face turning pale, the designer sunglasses completely forgotten on the table. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "It means," I said, leaning forward and looking directly into Julian's terrified eyes, "that every dollar of tuition, every expensive textbook, every custom suit, and every luxury steak dinner you ate for the last 5 years was not a gift from a loving wife. It was a heavily documented corporate loan from my company. You borrowed that money from me, Julian, and according to the terms you legally signed without reading, that loan accrued at a 12% compound interest rate with severe penalties for default. You thought you were using me as a stepping stone. You thought you could bleed me dry and walk away into high society. But while you were busy playing the golden boy, I was meticulously keeping the receipts. You do not owe me an apology for your betrayal or your public humiliation. You owe my corporate entity $500,000 payable immediately upon the legal dissolution of our marriage. And if you cannot pay it by the end of the week, I will personally file the paperwork to garnish your brand new astronomical salary for the next 20 years. By the time Sunday brunch arrived, the conference room humiliation was entirely forgotten by my mother-in-law. Beatrice sat at a prime patio table at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The club was a bastion of old Atlanta money with sprawling green golf courses and waiters wearing pristine white gloves. Beatrice had invited 7 prominent society women to celebrate Julian's official transition into the legal elite. She sat at the head of the table wearing a bright yellow silk dress, acting as if she had personally negotiated his contract. For 2 straight hours, she loudly bragged about her son, the brilliant lawyer, and his stunning new girlfriend, Chloe Sterling. She made sure everyone knew Chloe came from an incredibly wealthy family, conveniently leaving out the fact that her son was still legally married to me. She described Chloe's penthouse as if she owned it herself. As the plates of expensive seafood and empty bottles of imported champagne were cleared away, the waiter approached with a leather billfold. The total was over $2,000. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively and offered to cover the entire table, looking for the ultimate ego boost. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy gold credit card. She had always called it the family emergency card. In reality, it was a corporate card tied directly to my accounting firm that I had allowed her to use for genuine emergencies like medical bills or house repairs. Of course, she had routinely abused it to fund her high society facade. The waiter took the gold card and walked over to the discreet payment terminal. Beatrice continued to hold court, laughing loudly at a joke. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the club manager walked over to the table holding the leather billfold and the gold card. His expression was a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed pity. He leaned down and whispered softly into Beatrice's ear, informing her that the card had been declined. Beatrice scoffed loudly, her cheeks flushing pink. She told him to run it again, claiming it was a simple bank error. The manager shook his head gently. He stated clearly enough for the 2 women sitting closest to hear that the issuer had permanently canceled the account. He then politely asked if she had another form of payment. Beatrice dug frantically through her purse, pulling out 2 personal credit cards. She handed them over with a nervous laugh, blaming the banking system. The manager returned 2 minutes later. Both personal cards had also been declined due to severe delinquency. The silence at the table was suffocating. 7 wealthy women stared at Beatrice as her carefully constructed illusion of wealth shattered into a million pieces. One of the women, a judge's wife, sighed and pulled out her own platinum card to settle the bill. She looked at Beatrice with absolute disdain. The sheer humiliation of being pitied by the exact women she had spent years trying to impress was worse than a physical blow. Beatrice grabbed her empty handbag and practically ran to the valet stand, leaving her pride entirely behind. First thing Monday morning, my office door violently swung open. Beatrice stormed past my receptionist, her face twisted in absolute fury. She marched right up to my mahogany desk and slammed her hands down on the polished wood. She was still wearing the same yellow silk dress from her disastrous brunch, looking completely unhinged. "How dare you embarrass me like that, Maya?" she screamed. "I was at the country club with the most important women in Atlanta. You call the bank and unblock that family emergency card this instant." I did not even blink. I slowly closed the spreadsheet I was working on and folded my hands on my desk. "I am not calling the bank." "Beatrice," I replied calmly. "And it was never a family emergency card. It was a corporate expense card, funded by the profits of my firm. You used it yesterday to try and buy $2,000 worth of champagne to celebrate the son who just served me with divorce papers. Did you really think I was going to keep funding your delusions?" Beatrice stood up straight, attempting to summon her haughty matriarch persona. "You owe this family," she snapped, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You owe us for taking you in. You are legally bound to support us until this divorce is finalized." I let out a sharp laugh. I reached into my bottom drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder labeled with her name. I tossed it onto the desk. I do not owe you a single dime, Beatrice. In fact, you owe me everything. Open the folder. She glared at me, but her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cover. Inside were 10 years of meticulously organized financial records. You have been completely broke since your husband passed away a decade ago. I stated, my voice cold and surgical. Your pension barely covers your grocery bills. For 5 years, I have quietly paid your property taxes, your utility bills, your car insurance, and those ridiculous country club dues. I even paid for the expensive catered dinners you hosted for your friends. I am the only reason you have not had to file for bankruptcy and move into a subsidized apartment. I saved your dignity because I loved your son, and I wanted peace. But peace is over. Beatrice stared at the highlighted bank transfers, proving that my money had been secretly keeping her entire life afloat. Her jaw trembled. I am cutting you off completely, Beatrice. Every auto pay is canceled. Every shared account is closed. You are going to have to learn how to live on the money you actually make, which according to my calculations will last you exactly 4 days in that massive house. You are nothing without my money. Get out of my office before I call building security to escort you out. Beatrice looked like she had just been physically struck. The arrogant matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified older woman who suddenly realized the floor had vanished beneath her feet. She backed away from my desk, turned around, and stumbled out the door without saying another word. Beatrice had barely cleared the lobby when my desk phone began to ring. I let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly who was going to panic next. Sure enough, a frantic voice message from Vanessa appeared in my inbox 3 minutes later. While Beatrice was experiencing her financial reckoning, Vanessa was facing an entirely different kind of disaster. Vanessa loved to portray herself as a successful luxury real estate agent on social media. She posted daily photos of massive mansions, claiming she had just closed another multi-million-dollar deal. The reality was that Vanessa was a terrible agent. She was lazy, abrasive, and routinely alienated wealthy buyers. For 3 years, I had quietly funneled my own high-net-worth accounting clients to her, just so she could make a few commissions and feel important. Even worse, she was completely incompetent at managing her finances. I had spent countless hours fixing her botched tax returns, covering up her massive discrepancies, so she would not get flagged by the government. But the moment Julian handed me those divorce papers, my charity work ended. I immediately withdrew my representation as her accountant of record and submitted her raw, unedited financial data for the current fiscal year. The resulting explosion was instantaneous. Vanessa had just checked her mailbox and found a certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a formal notice of an aggressive comprehensive audit covering the last 3 years of her business operations. Without my careful accounting to hide her reckless personal spending, masked as business expenses, she was facing tens of thousands of dollars in penalties and potential fraud charges. Terrified and out of options, Vanessa drove straight to Chloe's luxury penthouse to find Julian. She dragged a hysterical Beatrice along with her. They banged on the heavy wooden doors until Julian finally opened them. He was wearing his cheap new suit, trying to review his onboarding paperwork for his big first day at Sterling & Sterling. "What is wrong with you two?" Julian hissed, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door half shut, so Chloe would not hear his panicked family. "Maya cut us off completely," Beatrice sobbed, clinging to his arm. "My cards are gone. I cannot buy groceries. I cannot pay the electric bill." Vanessa waved the certified IRS letter in his face, her hands shaking violently. "And she threw me to the wolves, Julian. The IRS is auditing my entire business. I am going to lose my real estate license. I could go to jail. You have to fix this right now. You have to call her and make her stop." Julian looked at his weeping mother and his terrified sister with absolute disgust. He physically peeled Beatrice's hands off his cheap suit jacket. "I am not calling Maya." He snapped, his voice laced with venom. "You two are acting completely pathetic. You are embarrassing me in front of the Sterlings. I start my new job tomorrow morning. My starting salary is $300,000 a year. That kind of money will solve all of your petty little issues by next week. Until then, figure it out yourselves and stay away from this penthouse." He stepped backward into the apartment and slammed the heavy door shut, leaving his mother and sister alone in the cold marble hallway. Julian did not look back as he walked into the expansive living room of Chloe's luxury penthouse. The heavy door clicking shut behind him sounded like the final severing of a heavy iron chain tying him to poverty. For his entire life, he had felt dragged down by the chaotic financial incompetence of his mother and sister. He had always secretly believed he was inherently better than them and destined for a life of extreme privilege. Now, as he stood in a room surrounded by imported Italian leather furniture, original contemporary artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline, he felt completely free. Chloe walked out of the master bedroom, wearing a silk slip, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She frowned slightly and asked him who had been making such a dreadful racket out in the private hallway. Julian casually loosened his cheap tie and poured himself an expensive drink from the crystal decanter resting on the marble wet bar. He smiled smoothly and told her it was just a couple of desperate beggars looking for a handout, and that building security had already escorted them off the premises. He did not feel a single ounce of guilt for locking his own flesh and blood out in the cold. In his calculating mind, Beatrice and Vanessa were simply casualties of his necessary ascent up the social ladder. If they were not smart enough to secure their own financial futures, they did not deserve to ride his coattails into high society. Chloe poured herself a drink and wrapped her arms around his waist. She told him her father was very impressed with his extreme ruthlessness regarding our sudden divorce. She said only a true sterling lawyer would have the stomach to freeze his ex-wife out of his life so quickly and efficiently. Julian puffed out his chest, swelling with massive pride. He told Chloe that I was a pathetic leech who had tried to trap him in a mediocre working-class life. He recounted the hostile mediation meeting, twisting the story to make himself sound like the victim of a jealous scam artist. He laughed aloud about the commercial loan document I had presented, telling Chloe it would never hold up in a real court because he would drag the litigation out for decades until I went bankrupt paying exorbitant legal fees. He spent the rest of the afternoon directing the luxury moving service that brought his few remaining boxes from the suburban house he had once shared with me. He meticulously arranged his expensive leather shoes in the massive walk-in closet and hung his new bespoke suits alongside Chloe's endless rows of designer dresses. Every single action was a deliberate erasure of his past. He absolutely refused to think about the massive $400,000 lien on the house or the looming threats of severe wage garnishment. In his incredibly arrogant mind, those were minor inconveniences that Richard Sterling would easily swat away like annoying flies. Julian was completely convinced that by tomorrow morning he would be entirely untouchable. He was the golden boy stepping into a realm of extreme wealth and limitless power, where minor accounting tricks from a bitter ex-wife simply did not matter. He spent the entire evening standing by the glass windows, looking down at the slow-moving city traffic, feeling a profound sense of absolute superiority. He drank his whiskey and imagined his name etched into the frosted glass doors of the law firm. He honestly believed he had outsmarted everyone and won the ultimate prize. He laughed softly to himself, mocking my small accounting firm and my cheap briefcases. He felt like a king surveying a kingdom he had conquered without ever lifting a sword. That same evening, Julian attended a highly exclusive pre-hire dinner with his future father-in-law, Richard Sterling. They met at the Capital City Club, a private institution where the membership fees alone cost more than what most people made in an entire year. Richard had reserved a secluded private dining room tucked away in the back of the establishment, heavily paneled in dark mahogany and smelling faintly of expensive cigars and aged leather. The private dining room was a true sanctuary for the ultra-rich. Oil paintings of 19th-century tycoons hung on the walls, silently judging the men plotting below them. The waiter brought out plates of thinly sliced Wagyu beef and imported truffles, serving food that Julian could never have imagined affording just a week ago. Julian sat across from the imposing senior partner, feeling a massive rush of adrenaline. Richard ordered a rare bottle of vintage wine that cost $4,000 and poured Julian a very generous glass. Richard Sterling did not just flatter Julian, he systematically groomed him. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and spoke about the heavy burden of immense wealth and how the law was simply a tool used by the elite to protect their empires from the unwashed masses. He painted a vivid picture of a future where Julian would be a senior partner, where he would have a massive estate in the Hamptons and a private jet at his immediate disposal. He praised Julian's sharp legal mind, his aggressive courtroom demeanor, and his ruthless personal ambition. Richard stated confidently that the firm was currently clearing out the old dead weight and bringing in fresh, hungry talent to handle their most sensitive corporate acquisitions. But Richard cautioned such extreme privilege required absolute, unquestioning loyalty. It required a man who would not ask unnecessary questions when handling the firm's most delicate offshore financial portfolios. Julian drank the expensive wine and soaked in the high praise, completely blind to the dangerous trap being set right in front of him. After the main course of dry-aged steak was cleared away, Richard reached down into his thick leather briefcase. He pulled out a massive stack of dense legal documents marked with bright red urgent stickers and placed them on the table between the empty wine glasses. Richard casually explained that these were just standard onboarding forms, routine compliance waivers, and authorizations for offshore account management. He claimed it was tedious bureaucratic paperwork required for Julian to be granted high-level security clearance within the firm's private global financial network. Richard handed Julian a heavy gold fountain pen and smiled warmly like a proud father. He told Julian to just sign on the dotted line so they could get the boring administrative work out of the way and focus on celebrating his new career. A truly smart lawyer would have stopped everything to read every single clause. A cautious man would have taken the heavy documents home to review them carefully with outside counsel. But Julian was absolutely desperate to prove he belonged in this room of elite power brokers. He was desperate to show Richard that he was a compliant, loyal soldier who implicitly trusted the family business. Blinded by his own massive hubris and the intoxicating promise of immense power, Julian took the gold pen. He did not read a single paragraph. He did not verify a single account number. He simply flipped through the thick stack of papers, quickly scribbling his signature on every page Richard pointed to. He signed away his liability, his legal deniability, and his entire future without a single second thought. When the final page was signed, Richard took the documents back and placed them carefully into his briefcase, locking the brass latches with a sharp, loud click. "Welcome to the inner circle, Julian," he said, raising his glass. "You are exactly the kind of man we need." While Julian was busy drinking expensive vintage wine and signing his life away in a private dining room, I was sitting completely alone in my dark office on the other side of the city. The entire accounting firm was completely empty and silent. The only light in the room came from the bright glow of 3 large computer monitors, arranged strategically on my mahogany desk. My desk was covered in highly classified financial flowcharts, thick manila envelopes, and heavily redacted federal wire transfer logs. I was not looking at Julian's personal bank accounts or Vanessa's audited tax returns anymore. Those were minor, petty distractions. I had moved on to the main event. My eyes rapidly scanned the scrolling data on the center screen, tracking a massive, complex web of illicit funds moving across international borders. The numbers blinking on the screen belonged to dozens of heavily guarded shell companies located in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Switzerland. These were the exact same offshore accounts that Julian had just blindly authorized himself as the primary legal manager of. He truly thought he was stepping into a legitimate high society law firm. He had absolutely no idea that Sterling and Sterling had been under intense federal scrutiny for the past 4 years. They were not just representing high-net-worth clients and famous celebrities. They were actively laundering tens of millions of dollars for dangerous organized crime syndicates and highly corrupt politicians. And I was the one who had finally cracked their sophisticated digital ledger. I had not stayed married to Julian for 5 agonizing years out of blind devotion or pathetic desperation. I stayed because his close proximity to the Sterling family gave me the absolutely perfect cover to run a quiet, methodical financial investigation from the inside. I had spent countless nights lying awake next to Julian while he slept soundly, waiting for his breathing to even out, before slipping out of bed to copy encrypted files from his unsecured laptop. I had risked my life and my freedom to build this massive federal case. If the cartel associates connected to these accounts had ever discovered what I was doing, I would have been killed instantly. But I had been meticulous. I had traced the dirty money as it flowed from illegal casinos through shell companies in Delaware before finally being washed clean in the offshore accounts Julian was now legally responsible for. The federal government had been trying to build a racketeering case against Richard Sterling for a decade, but he was far too smart. He never put his own name on the truly toxic documents. He always used a desperate fall guy to take the blame. And Julian, blinded by his own narcissistic ambition, was the perfect idiot for the job. My phone suddenly vibrated on the desk, shattering the heavy silence of the dark office. The caller ID displayed a restricted government number, but I knew exactly who was calling me. I picked up the phone and held it to my ear without saying a single word. A deep, commanding voice spoke through the tiny speaker. It was Special Agent Vance from the Federal Criminal Investigation Division. "We have the paper trail, Maya," the agent said, his tone completely serious. "Our surveillance team just confirmed the drop. He signed right where you said he would." I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the immense, crushing weight of 5 years of stressful undercover work finally begin to lift off my shoulders. "We have him," I replied softly, staring at the glowing numbers on my screen. "Tomorrow morning we bring the entire house of cards down. Make sure the tactical teams are in position before 9. The agent confirmed the order and hung up, leaving me alone in the dark to finally savor my absolute victory. The fallout from Julian's sudden financial ruin was not limited to his immediate family. Chloe Sterling, despite her inherited wealth and immense privilege, was not accustomed to dealing with a man who was constantly on edge. Julian was no longer the confident, smooth-talking lawyer she had stolen away from me. He was increasingly irritable, constantly checking his dead phone and snapping at her when she asked him simple questions about his day. His anxiety was a direct result of the massive $500,000 commercial loan I had called in an obligation he knew he could not avoid forever. But instead of seeing Julian's mounting stress as a warning sign about his character, Chloe decided to place the blame entirely on me. In her warped perspective, I was the bitter ex-wife who was refusing to let go a jealous woman trying to punish a man for moving up in the world. Chloe decided that the best way to support her fiancé was to utterly destroy my professional reputation. Chloe's attack was swift and incredibly vicious. It began on a Wednesday afternoon when my firm's receptionist alerted me to a sudden influx of bizarre online reviews. Dozens of one-star ratings had materialized on our business page within hours. The comments were not subtle. They accused my firm of gross incompetence, unethical billing practices, and even alleged that I had personally stolen money from elderly clients. I recognized the language immediately. It was the kind of dramatic, legally adjacent terminology a spoiled law student might use. But Chloe did not stop at petty online slander. By Thursday morning, I received a certified letter from the State Board of Accountancy. Someone had filed a formal anonymous complaint against my CPA license, alleging severe professional misconduct and demanding an immediate revocation of my credentials. The complaint was filled with fabricated evidence and twisted interpretations of standard accounting practices. It was a clear, coordinated effort to strip me of my livelihood and force me into absolute submission. Chloe wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would have no choice but to drop the financial claims against Julian just to survive. She believed her father's powerful name would shield her from any consequences, assuming I was just a small-time number cruncher who would fold under the pressure of an official board investigation. I did not fold. I did not panic. I simply picked up my briefcase, locked my office door, and decided it was time to address the problem directly. I drove straight to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Sterling and Sterling in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The lobby was a massive expanse of imported marble, gleaming steel, and intimidating security guards. I walked confidently up to the front desk and asked the receptionist to inform Chloe Sterling that Maya was here to see her. The receptionist, recognizing the Sterling name, immediately picked up the phone. Less than 5 minutes later, the elevator doors slid open and Chloe stepped out. She was wearing a stunning white designer suit, looking every inch the heiress she was. However, the smug satisfaction on her face vanished the second she saw me standing calmly by the massive indoor waterfall. She marched over her heels, clicking aggressively against the marble floor, signaling 2 burly security guards to follow her. "What do you think you are doing here, Maya?" Chloe demanded, her voice echoing loudly in the cavernous lobby. She intentionally spoke loud enough to draw the attention of the other elegantly dressed professionals waiting for elevators. "Are you really? This desperate Julian does not want you? You are a bitter, broke ex-wife who cannot accept that she was dumped for someone better. This is a private building, and I am having security throw you out right now." The 2 guards stepped forward, their hands resting near their radios, ready to physically remove me from the premises. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show any sign of intimidation. I held my ground and looked Chloe directly in the eyes, allowing a slow, chilling smile to spread across my face. I took a deliberate step closer to her, invading her personal space so completely that the security guards hesitated, unsure of how to react to my absolute calm. "I am not here for Julian, Chloe," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, ensuring the guards could not hear the exact words. "I am here because of the childish little game you played with the state board this morning. You think you are untouchable because your daddy's name is on the wall." I leaned in even closer, my lips inches from her ear. "You think you are clever, but you are painfully ignorant. Let's talk about your personal trust fund, shall we? The one established in the Cayman Islands under the shell corporation, Azure Holdings. Specifically, let's discuss the sequence of tax evasion codes attached to the wire transfers you received last month. Code 409, a cross-referenced with offshore ledger 88 Delta. I pulled back just enough to see the immediate catastrophic change in her expression. The arrogant sneer had vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from Chloe's face so fast she looked physically ill. The codes I had just whispered were highly classified, federal tracking numbers, specific identifiers that proved her massive trust fund was composed entirely of laundered cartel money. No one outside of the federal task force and the criminals themselves knew those codes existed. The realization that I possessed that level of intimate, highly illegal financial data hit her like a physical blow. She suddenly understood that I was not a simple accountant. I was a loaded weapon pointed directly at her family's empire. Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes wide with panic. She raised a shaking hand and signaled the security guards to back away. The guards looked confused, but complied, stepping back into their designated positions. Chloe could not speak. She simply stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the danger she was now in. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase, smoothing the lapel of my tailored jacket. I looked past her terrified face, gazing up at the massive polished steel Sterling and Sterling logo mounted on the wall above the reception desk. I smiled again, a genuine expression of absolute victory. "Enjoy your weekend, Chloe," I said, clearly turning my back on her and walking toward the revolving glass doors. "Monday is going to be incredibly busy." The 24-hour deadline I had given Julian to clear the $400,000 commercial lien expired precisely at 9 in the morning on Saturday. I did not send a reminder text. I did not call to negotiate. I simply executed the default clause I had legally embedded in the loan agreement. By 10 o'clock, the Fulton County Sheriff's Department was pulling into the long, manicured driveway of the 4-bedroom suburban house. 2 deputies stepped out of their cruisers, walked up the stone pathway, and knocked loudly on the heavy front door. Inside, Beatrice and Vanessa were still trying to figure out how to order breakfast without a working credit card. When Vanessa opened the door, the deputies handed her a formal writ of possession and informed her they had exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Beatrice shrieked, insisting there was a mistake, claiming her son was a powerful attorney who owned the property. The deputies remained completely impassive. They explained that the property was now legally owned by my corporate entity due to a severe financial default. The eviction was swift and utterly humiliating. The women frantically stuffed their remaining designer clothes and expensive makeup into whatever bags they could find. The deputies escorted them out, watching closely as a locksmith arrived to immediately change every deadbolt on the property. Beatrice and Vanessa stood on the pristine front lawn, surrounded by their hastily packed garbage bags and expensive luggage as the Georgia summer heat began to rise. They watched as the heavy front doors were locked from the inside, permanently barring them from the luxurious lifestyle they had stolen from me. Neighbors who Vanessa had always treated with extreme arrogance began peeking through their curtains and stepping out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. Beatrice hid her face behind her oversized sunglasses, sobbing openly, while Vanessa aggressively dialed her phone, desperate for a lifeline. Vanessa dialed Julian's number 7 times before he finally answered. When the call connected, she didn't even say hello. She just started screaming into the receiver. "Julian, the police just kicked us out of the house," Vanessa wailed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "They changed the locks. Maya actually did it. We are standing on the lawn like common criminals. You have to send an Uber Black to come pick us up right now. Let us stay at Chloe's penthouse until you sort this out." Julian was sitting on the plush leather sofa in Chloe's living room, sipping his morning espresso. He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, grimacing at the sound of his sister's hysterics. Chloe walked into the room, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow at him. Julian covered the mouthpiece. "It's just Vanessa," he mouthed to Chloe, rolling his eyes. He put the phone back to his ear. "Listen to me, Vanessa," Julian said, his voice cold and devoid of any brotherly affection. "You cannot come to the penthouse. Chloe and I are hosting a private luncheon for some senior partners today. Having you and Mom drag your garbage bags through the lobby of this building is completely unacceptable. You are embarrassing my brand." Vanessa stopped crying, completely stunned by his utter lack of empathy. "Your brand," she whispered in disbelief. "We are your family, Julian. We have nowhere to go. Mom's cards are blocked. I have zero cash. I have an IRS audit breathing down my neck. You have to help us." Julian scoffed, a harsh, cruel sound. "I do not have to do anything, Vanessa. I warned you to stay out of my way. You two brought this entirely on yourselves by provoking Maya. Figure out your own problems. Call a shelter or a cheap motel. Do not call this number again this weekend." Without waiting for a response, Julian ended the call. He swiped his thumb across the screen and completely blocked Vanessa's number. He then blocked Beatrice's number just to be safe. He set the phone down on the glass coffee table, smiled warmly at Chloe, and asked her what time the caterers were arriving. Back on the suburban lawn, Vanessa stared at her dead phone. She looked over at Beatrice, who was sitting on a designer suitcase, weeping into her hands. The golden boy they had worshipped and enabled for 3 decades had completely abandoned them the moment they became a liability to his new wealth. Desperation is a powerful motivator. It strips away pride and forces people to make choices they would never consider otherwise. An hour after Julian hung up on her, Vanessa spent the last $20 of cash she had in her purse to pay a cab driver to take her to my private office building. She bypassed the receptionist, who was away from her desk, and walked straight to my closed office door. She knocked softly, completely unlike her usual aggressive demeanor. I called out, telling whoever it was to enter. Vanessa stepped inside, looking completely disheveled. Her hair was messy, her makeup was smudged from crying, and her designer clothes looked wrinkled and cheap. She closed the door behind her and stood awkwardly in front of my mahogany desk. "Maya," Vanessa started, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." I did not stop typing on my computer. I simply looked up at her over the top of my monitors, my expression perfectly neutral. Vanessa took a deep breath and launched into a tearful, desperate monologue. "I am so sorry, Maya, for everything. Julian kicked us to the curb. He blocked our numbers. He left Mom and me sitting on the lawn like trash. You were right about him all along. He is selfish and arrogant. Vanessa stepped closer, placing her hands on the edge of my desk, trying to look sincere. I never liked how he treated you, Maya. I swear. I always told Mom he was taking advantage of you, but I was just trying to keep the peace in the family. I was scared of him. Please, you have to help me. The IRS is threatening to seize my bank accounts. If you just unblock my files and help me negotiate with them, I promise I will testify against Julian in court. I will tell the judge he abused you financially. I will be your star witness. I stopped typing. I leaned back in my chair and stared at Vanessa. She was literally shaking, terrified of the massive financial consequences bearing down on her. But her apology was completely hollow. It was a desperate performance born of pure self-preservation, not genuine remorse. She was willing to completely destroy her brother to save herself, just as he had completely abandoned her to save himself. The family dynamic I had tolerated for 5 years was finally eating itself alive. Vanessa, I said softly, my voice calm and completely devoid of pity. You are not scared of Julian. You worshipped him. You enabled his arrogance because you thought you could ride his coattails to a wealthy life. You laughed at me at the restaurant when he handed me those divorce papers. You cheered him on. Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but I raised my hand, silencing her immediately. You only hate him now because he cut you off. You only came to me because you need my skills to save you from federal prison. I do not need a star witness, Vanessa. My financial records are bulletproof. I stood up from my chair and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. You spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated servant while secretly living off the money I earned. You insulted my background, you mocked my career, and you actively encouraged your brother to cheat on me. Your IRS audit is not a mistake. It is the direct consequence of your own financial fraud, without my expertise to hide it anymore. I pointed toward the heavy wooden door. Get out of my office, Vanessa, and never come back. Vanessa stared at me, her face pale, realizing her manipulation had completely failed. She turned around and walked out, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate. I walked over to the closet in the corner of my office. I opened the door and pulled out the dry cleaning bag hanging inside. I unzipped the plastic to reveal my final outfit for Monday morning. It was not a cheap polyester suit as Beatrice had maliciously claimed. It was a sharp, custom-tailored power suit in deep navy blue, paired with a crisp white silk blouse. It was the armor I would wear to deliver the final devastating blow. I ran my hand over the smooth fabric, feeling a surge of cold, calculated anticipation. Julian had spent the weekend celebrating his ascension to power, completely unaware that he had signed his own financial death warrant. Chloe thought she had intimidated me with her childish threats. Beatrice and Vanessa were already ruined, broken by their own entitlement. The pieces were all perfectly aligned on the board. The federal agents were briefed and ready. The trap had been flawlessly executed. I carefully zipped the plastic bag closed and locked my office door. The endgame had officially arrived, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Monday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Julian woke up feeling like the absolute master of his universe. The panic of the weekend, the frantic phone calls from his evicted mother and sister, and the lingering threat of my commercial lien were entirely erased from his mind. Today was his coronation. Chloe had ordered a brand-new, wildly expensive Italian wool suit for him to replace the cheap, off-the-rack disaster he had worn to the mediation. He stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, adjusting the silk tie, admiring the sharp reflection of a man who had finally conquered the world. He drove to the downtown financial district, the engine of his sports car purring loudly as he pulled into the private underground parking garage of the Sterling & Sterling Tower. He stepped into the exclusive executive elevator, swiping his newly minted gold keycard to access the 45th floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, he was greeted by the hushed, reverent atmosphere of extreme wealth. The receptionist smiled warmly at him, addressing him respectfully by his formal title. He was escorted down a wide hallway lined with expensive modern art to his new workspace. It was not a cubicle. It was a massive corner office with panoramic views of the entire Atlanta skyline. A heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, polished to a mirror shine. A crystal carafe of ice water and a silver tray of fresh coffee waited for him. He walked over to the thick glass windows and looked down at the tiny cars crawling along the streets below. He laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the massive, empty room. He thought about my tiny accounting firm with its fluorescent lights and cheap carpets. He thought about my legal threat to garnish his wages. He genuinely believed that with one single phone call from Richard Sterling, my entire business would be crushed into dust. He sat down in the buttery leather executive chair, leaning back and resting his hands behind his head. He spun the leather chair around, taking in the expensive bookshelves lined with thick legal volumes that he would never actually have to read. He opened the top drawer of his desk and found a box of custom-printed business cards resting on a velvet pad. The name printed in bold letters read, Julian Senior Counsel. He picked one up and traced the raised gold lettering with his thumb. This single piece of cardstock proved that he was better than everyone who had ever doubted him. It proved that abandoning his mother to face the sheriff and leaving his sister to battle an IRS audit were simply the necessary costs of greatness. He was untouchable. He was the golden boy. He had successfully discarded the dead weight of his past and stepped into his rightful place as a king. At exactly 10 o'clock, the sleek black telephone on his desk chimed softly. It was Richard Sterling's executive assistant, informing him in a hushed tone that the senior partners were ready for him in the main boardroom. Julian stood up, buttoned his tailored jacket, and walked down the expansive hallway with a swagger he had never possessed before. The boardroom was a cavernous space designed specifically to intimidate opposing counsel. A massive table carved from a single slab of dark oak dominated the center of the room. 20 senior partners sat around it, men and women dressed in conservative but incredibly expensive clothing. They radiated quiet, ruthless power. Richard Sterling sat at the absolute head of the table, flanked by his most trusted associates. When Julian entered, the low murmur of conversation instantly ceased. Richard smiled a tight, calculating smile and gestured for Julian to stand beside him at the front of the room. Richard cleared his throat, pouring a glass of sparkling water before addressing the powerful group. He spoke eloquently about the rapid global expansion of the firm, the aggressive new financial strategies they were deploying, and the absolute necessity for fresh, fearless legal minds. Then Richard turned to Julian and placed a heavy paternal hand on his shoulder. He did not introduce Julian as a junior associate or a standard hire. He formally announced to the board that Julian was stepping into a highly specialized, highly sensitive executive role. Richard declared him the firm's new head of offshore acquisitions. A polite round of applause rippled around the oak table. Julian felt a massive surge of adrenaline rush through his veins. He stood taller, soaking in the admiration of Atlanta's elite. He had no idea that the older partners were not looking at him with genuine respect. They were looking at him the way starving wolves look at a tethered goat. They knew exactly what the title head of offshore acquisitions actually meant. They knew it was a fake position designed entirely to hold the legal liability for the firm's massive international money laundering operations. But Julian was completely blinded by his own narcissism. He delivered a short, arrogant speech thanking Richard for the incredible opportunity and promising to protect the firm's assets with absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He swore to aggressively expand their international portfolios and take the Sterling name to unprecedented new heights. He promised to streamline their overseas holdings using the exact financial jargon he had skimmed from the documents he signed blindly at the private dinner. Several of the senior partners nodded slowly, suppressing their dark amusement. They were watching a man eagerly volunteer to walk the plank, completely unaware of the sharks circling below. Julian finished his speech with a confident smile, believing he had just cemented his legacy among the titans of the legal industry. Julian had just finished speaking and was pulling out a heavy leather chair to take his rightful seat among the elite when a loud, sharp noise shattered the dignified silence of the boardroom. The heavy frosted glass doors at the entrance of the room did not just open, they swung inward with massive force, banging loudly against the wood-paneled walls. Every single senior partner jumped their heads, snapping toward the entrance in absolute shock. I walked calmly into the room. I was wearing the custom-tailored navy blue power suit, my hair pulled back sharply, carrying my expensive leather briefcase. I did not look like a bitter, broken ex-wife begging for attention. I looked like the executioner. Julian's face transitioned rapidly from sheer shock to a shade of dark, furious crimson. The extreme embarrassment of having his grand professional moment interrupted by the woman he had publicly discarded sent him into an immediate, blinding rage. He slammed his hands flat on the oak table and stood up, nearly knocking his chair over. "Maya, what the hell are you doing here?" he yelled, his voice cracking with uncontrolled fury. "This is a secure private floor. You are completely insane if you think you can just walk into my firm and throw a tantrum." Richard Sterling also stood up, his face hardening into a dangerous scowl as he reached under the edge of the table for the emergency security button. Julian did not wait for the guards to arrive. He marched aggressively toward me, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, attempting to assert his dominance in front of his new colleagues. "Get out of this building right now!" Julian screamed, the veins bulging prominently in his neck. "I warned you about playing these petty financial games. I swear to God I will have you thrown in a federal jail cell for trespassing and corporate harassment." I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice to match his desperate hysterics. I simply stood my ground, looking directly at his furious, sweating face with an expression of absolute chilling serenity. Julian opened his mouth to scream for the building security team again, preparing to unleash another barrage of arrogant threats, but the words died completely in his throat. The sound of heavy synchronized boots echoed loudly from the marble hallway outside the boardroom. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, his raised hand slowly lowering to his side as the blood drained entirely from his face. Stepping through the wide doorway right behind me were 4 heavily armed FBI agents wearing dark tactical vests with bright yellow lettering, immediately followed by 2 stern-faced IRS criminal investigators. The sudden and overwhelming influx of heavily armed federal agents instantly transformed the atmosphere of the boardroom from a hub of elite corporate power to an active, chaotic crime scene. Richard Sterling, a man who had spent his entire adult life intimidating judges and terrifying opposing counsel, immediately puffed out his chest. He attempted to project an aura of absolute authority, completely ignoring the tactical rifles strapped to the chests of the men entering his private domain. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard bellowed, his deep voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "This is a private law firm. You cannot simply barge into my boardroom without a signed federal warrant. I will have the badges of every single man in this room before the lunch hour." The lead FBI agent, a tall, incredibly imposing, broad-shouldered man named Vance, stepped forward immediately. He did not look intimidated in the slightest. He casually reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents, and tossed them onto the polished oak table right in front of Richard. "We have warrants for the entire building," Mr. Sterling. Agent Vance said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Warrants to seize every physical hard drive, every filing cabinet, and every offshore digital ledger on this premises." Julian, who was still standing frozen at the head of the table, looked wildly between the armed agents and me. "Maya, what did you do?" Julian stammered, his voice trembling as the reality of the situation began to violently crash down around him. "Did you call the police because of the divorce? Are you really trying to ruin my firm over a petty domestic dispute? You are completely out of your mind. They are going to lock you away for this." Agent Vance turned his head and looked at Julian with an expression of profound pity mixed with absolute disgust. "Shut your mouth, son," Vance commanded sharply. You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to. Vance turned his attention back to Richard Sterling and the 20 senior partners who were now sitting in terrified silence. Allow me to formally introduce the woman you have been disrespecting, Vance announced, his voice carrying clearly across the massive room. This is not a bitter ex-wife. This is Maya. She is a special government contractor and the lead forensic auditor for the United States Department of Justice. A collective gasp rippled around the oak table. The senior partners, men and women who billed thousands of dollars an hour, stared at me in sheer horror. Julian physically recoiled as if he had just been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant sneer he had worn just minutes ago was completely wiped from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at my cheap briefcase, the one his mother had mocked, and suddenly realized it was the weapon that had just destroyed his entire existence. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, the federal agents parting seamlessly to let me through. I stopped right next to Julian, close enough to see the beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead. I slowly placed my heavy leather briefcase directly onto the center of the polished oak table. The heavy brass locks clicked loudly in the silent room, echoing exactly as they had during our hostile mediation. Did you honestly believe I was just a naive, exhausted woman crunching numbers in a cubicle, Julian? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Did you really think I spent 5 years working 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my own happiness and tolerating your unbearable family, just because I was desperately in love with your potential? Julian stared at me, his eyes wide and completely vacant, his mind entirely unable to process the absolute destruction of his reality. I never cared about your law degree, Julian, I stated clearly, making sure every senior partner in the room heard the absolute truth. I never cared about your arrogant ambition or your desperate need to climb the social ladder. 3 years ago, the Department of Justice flagged an anomaly in a series of highly complex offshore wire transfers. The feds knew Sterling and Sterling was actively laundering tens of millions of dollars for international cartels, but Richard was too smart. He hid behind layers of corporate shell companies and attorney-client privilege. The government could not pierce the corporate veil from the outside. They needed an inside operative. They needed someone who could walk right past the security guards, access the internal networks, and map the financial flow without raising a single red flag. I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with Richard Sterling, whose face had turned a sickly shade of gray. And then I continued. A stroke of absolute luck fell right into the lap of the Justice Department. My incredibly arrogant, completely oblivious husband secured a summer internship at this exact law firm. You were the perfect Trojan horse, Julian. You were so desperate to impress these men, so eager to prove you belonged in high society, that you brought your work home every single night. You bragged about the firm's confidential clients. You left your laptop unsecured on our kitchen counter. You practically handed me the keys to the kingdom. I did not pay your tuition out of the goodness of my heart. I funded your entire lifestyle as a highly classified operational expense. I paid for your custom suits and your luxury car because I needed you to look the part. I pushed you to climb the ranks, to network with the senior partners, and to secure a permanent position here so I could maintain my completely undetected access to the Sterling Empire. You were never the architect of your own success, Julian. You were simply a highly manipulated pawn on my chessboard. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit Julian like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to lean heavily against the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. You used me, he whispered, his voice cracking, tears of absolute panic welling in his eyes. You used our entire marriage to build a federal case. I used you exactly the way you intended to use me, Julian, I replied without a single ounce of sympathy. You thought I was a stepping stone. You thought you could bleed me dry and discard me the moment you got your hands on real power. But while you were busy sleeping with the senior partner's daughter and plotting your grand exit, I was meticulously copying your hard drives while you slept. I was pulling the encrypted metadata from every single document you foolishly brought into my house. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors burst open again. Chloe pushed her way past two federal agents stationed in the hallway, her face flushed red and her designer dress completely disheveled. She had clearly been waiting in Richard's private office to celebrate Julian's promotion and panicked when she saw the FBI raiding the floor. Daddy Chloe screamed, running toward Richard Sterling, but being immediately intercepted by Agent Vance, who held up a stern hand to stop her advance. "What are they doing here? Tell them to leave right now. Tell them who you are." Richard did not say a word. He just stared blankly at the tabletop, knowing absolutely that his reign of power was completely over. Chloe spun around and glared at me, her eyes filled with toxic venom. "This is your fault," Chloe shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You are a liar and a completely psychotic stalker. My father is an innocent man. He is a pillar of the Atlanta community. You are just trying to destroy us because Julian chose me over your pathetic, broke existence." I reached into my opened briefcase. I did not pull out a single sheet of paper or a fabricated bank statement. I pulled out a massive, densely packed 500-page dossier bound in heavy black leather. It contained thousands of cross-referenced offshore account numbers, cartel aliases, and explicitly detailed wire fraud logs. I lifted the heavy document and dropped it forcefully onto the center of the mahogany boardroom table. The heavy thud echoed like a final judge's gavel. I looked directly at the spoiled heiress who had tried to intimidate me just 3 days prior. "Read the file, Chloe," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Your father is the kingpin of a massive, ruthless international money-laundering syndicate." I turned my gaze slowly from Chloe to the terrified, hyperventilating man standing next to me. "And your brilliant fiancé," I said, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally cross my face, "is the pathetic fall guy who just signed his life away to take the blame for all of it." Julian stared at me, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He shook his head frantically, rejecting the reality of his situation. "I am a Sterling, and Sterling lawyer." Julian practically whispered, his voice trembling as he looked toward Richard for validation. "I am the head of offshore acquisitions. You cannot just invent a story to ruin my career." I let out a sharp, echoing laugh that cut through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "You really are completely blind to your own mediocrity, Julian," I said, stepping closer. "Did you honestly believe a multi-million-dollar law firm catering to the global elite was waiting to hire a newly graduated law student with zero practical experience? Did you think Richard Sterling looked at your completely average academic record and saw a legal prodigy? Richard did not offer you a starting salary of $300,000 and a massive corner office because you are smart, Julian. He offered you this job because you are a desperate, arrogant narcissist who is incredibly easy to manipulate." I gestured toward Richard, who was now sitting rigidly in his chair, refusing to make eye contact with the man he had intended to sacrifice. "A criminal syndicate like this does not recruit brilliant legal minds to handle dirty money, Julian. Brilliant lawyers ask questions. Brilliant lawyers demand transparency. Brilliant lawyers actually read the fine print." Richard needed a completely expendable idiot. He needed someone who was so utterly blinded by the illusion of wealth, so desperate to sit at the adults' table, that he would do whatever he was told without a single second thought. You walked into this firm radiating insecurity and toxic pride. You were the perfect target. You wanted the bespoke suits, the expensive dinners, and the bragging rights so badly that you completely turned off your brain. You thought they were grooming you for greatness, but they were actually fattening you up for the slaughter. They needed a designated scapegoat to take the devastating fall when the federal government inevitably closed in on their operation. And you, in your infinite arrogance, practically begged them to put the target directly on your back. You discarded me because I did not fit your wealthy new aesthetic, completely oblivious that I was the only person keeping you out of a federal penitentiary. By discarding your mother and sister the second they became a financial liability over the weekend, you proved to Richard Sterling that you had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but yourself. That extreme selfishness signaled to the cartel that you could be easily bought. You thought your lack of morals made you a corporate shark, but it actually made you the perfect bait. Julian was physically shaking now, gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. I did not do anything illegal, Julian shouted, his voice cracking hysterically. I have only been an official employee of this firm for exactly 1 hour. I have not processed a single transaction. I have not spoken to a single client. You have absolutely no evidence against me. I looked at him with absolute pity. I reached out and tapped the heavy black leather dossier resting on the table. You really should have paid more attention during your expensive law school classes, I replied smoothly. Do you remember that highly exclusive pre-hire dinner you attended with Richard at the Capital City Club last Friday evening? The one where you drank $4,000 vintage wine and ate imported truffles. Richard brought a very thick stack of legal documents for you to sign. He told you they were just routine compliance waivers and standard onboarding forms. And because you were so desperate to impress your future father-in-law, you took his gold fountain pen and signed your name on every single page he put in front of you. Julian gasped, his hands flying up to cover his mouth as the horrifying memory suddenly clicked into place. Those were not compliance waivers, Julian. I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. You legally appointed yourself as the sole managing director and primary executor of 27 different offshore shell companies. You formally claimed full fiduciary responsibility for every single dollar that moved through those accounts over the last 36 months. You legally retroactively adopted their financial history as your own operational responsibility. You essentially signed a legally binding confession to international wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The federal agents standing in this room do not need you to process a new transaction today. The documents you blindly signed on Friday night already provided them with all the necessary legal authorization to arrest you. You handed the Justice Department your own head on a silver platter. Every illegal transfer the cartel made, every bribe Richard Sterling orchestrated, is now legally tied directly to your personal signature. The brilliant legal mind, who thought he could easily outsmart his working-class wife, did not even bother to read the contract that permanently signed his entire life away. Do you have any idea what the mandatory minimum sentences are for the charges you just confessed to Julian? The wire fraud alone carries a 20-year federal sentence. The tax evasion adds another 5. Conspiracy to launder cartel funds will ensure you never see the outside of a maximum security facility for the rest of your natural life. You will be disbarred before you even try your very first case. The Sterling family will hire armies of elite lawyers to cut plea deals for themselves, and they will use your legally binding signatures to throw the entire weight of the prosecution directly onto your shoulders. The massive commercial lien I placed on your house was just a calculated distraction to keep you financially desperate over the weekend. It ensured you would rush blindly into Richard Sterling's open arms on Monday morning without seeking any outside legal counsel. You walked right into a federal trap. As the absolute finality of my words sank in, the boardroom descended into total chaos. Agent Vance gave a sharp nod to his tactical team. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs being unpouched echoed loudly. 2 federal agents moved swiftly toward the head of the table. Richard did not fight. He stood up slowly, his face devoid of any emotion, and placed his hands behind his back. The arrogant senior partner, the untouchable kingpin of Atlanta, was securely handcuffed and read his Miranda rights in front of his entire board of directors. Chloe began screaming hysterically. She lunged forward, trying to grab her father, but a female IRS investigator immediately intercepted her. The investigator firmly pinned Chloe's arms behind her back, applying cold steel cuffs to her delicate wrists. Chloe sobbed wildly, screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with the firm's business. The investigator calmly informed her that because she had been knowingly funding her lavish lifestyle, purchasing luxury real estate, and maintaining her offshore trust fund using illicit cartel money, She was being detained as an active co-conspirator. The spoiled heiress who had tossed a $50,000 check at my feet was now being dragged out of the boardroom, kicking and screaming like a petulant child. Then, Agent Vance turned his imposing figure toward Julian. Julian did not try to run. He did not try to argue legal statutes. The sheer magnitude of his complete failure completely shattered his mind. His legs simply gave out beneath him. The expensive Italian wool suit crumpled as Julian collapsed heavily onto his knees, right in the middle of the boardroom floor. He began hyperventilating his chest, heaving violently as he gasped for air that his lungs refused to process. He looked up at me from the floor, tears streaming down his face, a pathetic puddle of a man. Agent Vance stepped behind him, grabbing Julian's wrists and yanking them roughly behind his back. The metal cuffs ratcheted tightly shut, biting into Julian's skin. Julian looked up from the polished hardwood floor, staring directly into my eyes. He looked at the woman he had relentlessly mocked. He looked at the woman his family had treated like dirt. He looked at the woman he genuinely believed was a completely expendable nobody. And in that exact terrifying moment, as the federal agents hauled him forcefully to his feet to drag him away to a federal holding cell, Julian finally realized the horrifying truth. I was not a stepping stone. I was the architect of his absolute destruction. I had systematically orchestrated the complete annihilation of his entire existence, and I had done it all right in front of his face. He realized that every late night I spent working, every quiet smile I offered, and every single dollar I transferred into his accounts was just another brick being laid in the wall of his inescapable prison. He had thrown away a woman who would have loyally built an honest life with him, all to chase a completely fabricated illusion of wealth that had now destroyed him forever. The massive boardroom was completely transformed into a buzzing hive of federal activity. Tactical agents were systematically dismantling the illusion of the sterling empire. Heavy filing cabinets were pried open with crowbars, and stacks of heavily encrypted hard drives were tossed into thick evidence-grade plastic bins. Richard Sterling was aggressively marched out the door by two armed guards. His head bowed, the fight entirely drained from his imposing frame. The echoing sounds of Chloe's hysterical sobbing faded down the long marble hallway as she was dragged toward the freight elevator in handcuffs. Amidst the organized chaos, Julian remained exactly where he had fallen. He was awkwardly hunched on his knees in the center of the room. His expensive tailored suit completely ruined his hands bound tightly behind his back. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from the federal agents to the senior partners who were now being lined up against the mahogany-paneled wall. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that no one was coming to save him. Richard had used him as a human shield, and his new colleagues were busy frantically calling their own defense attorneys. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the massive oak table, my arms crossed, watching the entire operation unfold with cold detachment. Julian shifted his weight and awkwardly shuffled forward on his knees, practically crawling across the polished hardwood floor until he was positioned directly at my feet. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and dripping with cold sweat. He let out a pathetic, ragged sob. "Maya, please, Julian," begged, his voice completely broken, his former arrogance entirely evaporated. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them I did not know. Tell them I was just a pawn. I will do whatever they want. I will testify against Richard. I will wear a wire. I am so sorry, Maya. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I did to you. I was stupid. I was blind. I let the money and the prestige poison my mind. But I love you, Maya. I have always loved you. You are the only real thing I have ever had." He leaned forward desperately, trying to press his tear-stained face against the hem of my navy blue skirt, but Agent Vance immediately stepped in, pressing a heavy combat boot firmly against Julian's shoulder to keep him pinned in place. Julian ignored the agent and kept his desperate eyes locked on mine. "You work for the Justice Department." "Maya," Julian pleaded, his voice rising in sheer panic. "You built this case. You have the power to fix this. You can grant me federal immunity. Tell them I was acting as your confidential informant. Tell them I was helping you gather the evidence. We are still married, Maya. We are legally husband and wife. You cannot let them take me to a federal prison. I invoke spousal privilege. You cannot testify against me, and they cannot force you to. Use your government pull to get me out of these handcuffs right now. Please, Maya, save me. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing for him. There was no lingering affection, no spark of pity, and certainly no remorse for the total destruction I had orchestrated. 5 years of silent suffering of watching him parade around in suits my money bought, while he treated me like an embarrassing secret, had burned away any remaining emotion I ever held for Julian. I uncrossed my arms and slowly reached down to my side, resting my hand on the smooth leather of my open briefcase, sitting on the oak table. Julian watched my movements with a spark of frantic hope, genuinely believing that his pathetic groveling had somehow worked. He honestly thought my years of quiet submission meant I was inherently weak, and that his desperate tears would trigger a sudden urge to protect him. He waited for me to signal Agent Vance to remove the steel handcuffs. Instead, my fingers slipped past the classified federal documents and found the exact item I had brought specifically for this concluding moment. I pulled my hand out of the briefcase. I was holding a thick, slightly wrinkled yellow envelope. The return address printed boldly in the top corner belonged to the high-profile family law attorney Julian had hired. It was the exact same envelope he had dramatically dropped onto my dinner plate at the lavish restaurant just 4 days ago, surrounded by 50 cheering guests. The bright yellow paper stood out starkly against the dark, somber tones of the boardroom. Julian stared at the envelope, the frantic hope instantly dying in his eyes, replaced by a deep, hollow confusion. You served me with these papers in front of a massive crowd because you wanted to publicly humiliate me, I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the federal raid like a sharpened blade. You wanted everyone to know that you were stepping into the elite class and permanently leaving your working-class baggage behind. You were so incredibly proud of this little yellow envelope. You smiled when you handed it to me. You stood tall and puffed out your chest while your mother and sister laughed at my expense. I held the envelope out, dangling it just inches from his tear-streaked face. I did not open it. I did not need to. We both knew exactly what the petition inside demanded. You filed these papers, rapidly pushing the court to process the initial separation request before you even started your first day at Sterling & Sterling. I continued, my tone completely merciless. You paid a premium retainer to that bulldog lawyer to ensure the filing was legally binding the very second it hit the judge's desk last Thursday afternoon. You were absolutely terrified that I would try to claim a piece of your massive new salary, so you rushed to legally sever us before you signed your lucrative employment contract. You wanted to make absolutely certain that the incredible wealth you were about to inherit belonged entirely and exclusively to you. Julian swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly in the quiet space between us. He was a law school graduate, and as I laid out the exact timeline of his own malicious actions, the horrifying legal reality began to dawn on him. I looked down at him, delivering the final crushing blow. You wanted a quick unilateral divorce to protect your future assets from me, I explained, speaking slowly so every single devastating word registered in his panicked mind. But by formally filing that petition with the court before you accepted this job, you legally severed our financial and legal union. The temporary restraining order you placed on our assets to lock me out of the bank accounts also established a hard, indisputable legal boundary between my actions and your actions moving forward. You are entirely correct about the concept of spousal privilege, Julian. If we were still a legally intact married couple, the Justice Department might have faced a significant hurdle in forcing me to testify against my own husband. But you took care of that problem for them. By initiating the dissolution of our marriage prior to signing those illegal offshore cartel documents, you proved to the federal government that we were entirely estranged. You proved that your criminal actions were taken independently, without my knowledge or consent as your spouse. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his level, making sure he could see the absolute victory burning in my eyes. "The government does not need you as an informant, Julian," I whispered, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "They already have me. I am the star witness for the federal prosecution. I am the one who handed them the entire cartel ledger. I have complete ironclad federal immunity for my undercover actions. And because you filed that yellow envelope, you do not get to hide behind my skirts anymore. You rushed the divorce so you would not have to share your wealth. Congratulations, Julian. You do not get to share my immunity either." Julian let out a gut-wrenching wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. He realized that his own greed, his own desperate attempt to leave me with nothing, was the exact legal mechanism that had sealed his fate. He had completely outsmarted himself. He had built his own gallows, tied his own noose, and eagerly pulled the lever. I straightened my posture, smoothing the front of my navy blue suit. The tactical team had finished clearing the floor, and the only thing left in the room was the shattered remnants of his massive ego. I did not say another word to him. I simply dropped the thick yellow envelope. It fluttered downward, landing softly on the polished hardwood floor, directly in front of his kneeling knees. Agent Vance grabbed Julian roughly by his upper arms and hauled him forcefully to his feet, spinning him around toward the heavy glass doors to face his new reality. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled over the city of Atlanta, leaving the once arrogant family completely buried beneath the rubble of their own entitlement. Beatrice, the woman who used to boast loudly at exclusive country club brunches, was now wearing a stiff polyester uniform, working the cash register at a discount retail store on the outskirts of the city. Her designer dresses had all been pawned to pay for her tiny, cramped apartment. Every day she endured the absolute humiliation of ringing up cheap merchandise for the very same working-class people she had spent her entire life ruthlessly mocking. There were no more catered dinners, no more emergency credit cards, and absolutely no one left to listen to her fabricated stories of high society pedigree. She was entirely alone, forced to face the harsh reality of a world she could no longer manipulate. Vanessa was faring even worse. Without my meticulous accounting to hide her decades of financial fraud, the Internal Revenue Service had torn through her real estate business with terrifying efficiency. Her luxury vehicle was gone, her bank accounts were completely seized, and she was currently living in a cheap roadside motel while awaiting her criminal trial for severe tax evasion. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, ensuring she would never sell another house again. But the most devastating fall belonged entirely to the golden boy. Julian was sitting in a 6-by-8-foot concrete holding cell in a maximum security federal detention center. Because he was considered a severe flight risk tied directly to an international cartel, the judge had completely denied his request for bail. He spent 23 hours a day locked in a small cage wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his once proud frame. The State Bar Association had moved with unprecedented speed, permanently stripping him of his law license before he ever had the chance to step foot inside a courtroom as a practicing attorney. He had absolutely nothing left. Chloe had immediately turned state's witness against him to save herself. Richard Sterling was actively trying to pin the entire criminal enterprise on Julian's signature, and his mother and sister vehemently refused to accept his collect calls. Julian was entirely isolated, left to rot in the dark, haunted every single night by the agonizing memory of the yellow envelope that had permanently sealed his terrifying fate. While the family that had tried to destroy me was busy surviving their own personal nightmares, my life had ascended to a level of profound solitary peace. I was sitting behind a massive desk in my brand-new ultra-modern corner office, located on the top floor of a prestigious downtown high-rise. The heavy glass doors bore the name of my newly expanded, highly elite forensic accounting firm. I did not have to hide in a gray cubicle anymore. The massive, highly classified federal operation that brought down Sterling and Sterling had concluded with a spectacular level of success. Because I was the primary whistleblower and the lead forensic auditor who provided the undeniable paper trail, the government contract had paid out a staggering multi-million-dollar bounty. I was completely financially independent, possessing a level of wealth that Julian and Chloe could only dream of achieving through their illegal shortcuts. I had easily absorbed the $400,000 suburban property from the defaulted commercial lien, sold it immediately for a massive cash profit, and completely erased the last physical trace of my former marriage. My reputation in the financial and legal sectors was absolutely unparalleled. High net worth clients, major corporations, and federal agencies were constantly bidding for my services, completely terrified of being on the wrong side of my audits. I was deeply respected, incredibly wealthy, and entirely unbothered by the opinions of anyone else. I did not have to sacrifice my weekends to cater to a demanding mother-in-law, nor did I have to endure the cruel passive-aggressive comments of a jealous sister-in-law. I never again had to shrink myself down to make an insecure, arrogant man feel taller. The crushing weight of playing the supportive, invisible wife had been entirely lifted from my shoulders, replaced by the incredible lightness of absolute freedom. I walked gracefully through the busy hallways of my firm, greeting my highly paid staff with genuine warmth, knowing that I had built this entire empire, using my own brilliant mind and my own relentless work ethic. I had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and strategically weaponized it, turning 5 years of quiet suffering into the ultimate foundation for my permanent success. Every single sacrifice I had made had finally returned to me multiplied, proving that true power never needs to boast loudly in a crowded room. That evening, I stepped out onto the expansive private balcony of my own luxury penthouse. The warm Georgia wind gently caught the fabric of my silk dress as I walked toward the edge of the glass railing. I held a crystal glass in my hand filled with the exact same expensive imported champagne that Julian had tried to ruin all those months ago at the restaurant. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, letting the crisp, cold liquid cool my throat. I looked out over the glittering, endless expanse of the Atlanta skyline, watching the city lights blink against the darkening sky. Down there, somewhere in the shadows, Julian was sitting in a concrete box, completely erased from the world he had desperately tried to conquer. Up here, I was breathing the crisp, clean air of total victory. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of pure joy that reached all the way to my eyes. I had been tested by fire, pushed to the absolute breaking point by people who genuinely believed I was weak. But I didn't just survive the fire. I was the one who struck the match, cut to black. The greatest lesson from this story is that true power never announces itself. Julian and his family confused Maya's quiet sacrifice with weakness, mistaking her silent endurance for submission. They built their towering arrogance on a foundation she secretly owned. When greed blinds you to the value of the people who genuinely support you, you inevitably engineer your own destruction. Never underestimate the quiet ones in the room. While you are busy demanding the spotlight, they might just be holding the script to your downfall. Have you ever been underestimated by toxic people? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more.